For centuries, Japan was an isolated island nation, anchored in a feudal past. Yet in less than a generation, it transformed into a modern superpower, an empire that challenged the great nations of the world. But its glory was fleeting and its downfall devastating. In this journey, we will explore how Japan moved from isolation to domination, and then to utter ruin. What forces fueled its imperial ambition? What cost did the nation and its neighbors bear? This is the fascinating and haunting story of Imperial Japan. During the Tokugawa period, from the early 1600s to the mid-19th century, Japan maintained a rigid feudal system and an isolationist foreign policy known as Sakoku. The country was largely closed to the outside world, except for limited trade with the Dutch and Chinese in Nagasaki. This era brought domestic peace and order, underpinned by a strict social hierarchy and a Confucian-based moral code that emphasized loyalty and stability. However, technological and military development stagnated in comparison to the rapidly industrializing West. In 1853, the unexpected arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet into Tokyo Bay, his black ships, marked a pivotal turning point. The technological disparity and the implicit threat of force shocked the Japanese leadership. Within a few years, the centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate had crumbled under internal dissent and external pressure, giving rise to the Meiji Restoration of 1868. This was not merely a political transition. It was a revolutionary transformation of Japanese society. Under Emperor Meiji, Japan adopted a centralized government modeled after European states, introduced universal conscription, and restructured its tax and land systems to support industrial growth. Students were sent abroad to absorb Western science, engineering, and governance, and foreign advisors were brought in to modernize infrastructure, military organization, and even the legal code. The military embraced German models of discipline and hierarchy, while the Navy took inspiration from the British Royal Navy. Economic development surged. Railroads crisscrossed the islands, textile industries flourished, and zaibatsu, large industrial conglomerates, began to dominate the economy. Cultural life shifted rapidly as Western clothing, architecture, and even baseball gained popularity. Yet modernization was not an abandonment of identity, but a strategic adaptation. It was tightly coupled with a sense of national pride and a belief in Japan's divine uniqueness. By 1900, Japan was no longer simply catching up, it was preparing to lead. By the end of the 19th century, modernization had sharpened Japan's appetite for geopolitical influence. Korea, long a tributary of China and a site of strategic and economic interest, became the first target. The First Sino-Japanese War erupted following a series of escalating tensions and Japanese military intervention in Korea. The Japanese military, well organized and technologically superior, swiftly defeated Qing forces. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to recognize Korean independence, cede Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands, and pay a hefty indemnity. Japan's triumph, however, was met with resentment from Western powers. The Triple Intervention, an imposed diplomatic agreement by Russia, France, and Germany, forced Japan to relinquish the Liaodong Peninsula. This intervention deeply humiliated Japan and planted a seed of antagonism, especially toward Russia. In response, Japan intensified its military preparations and economic consolidation. A decade later, in 1904, Japan launched a preemptive strike on Russia at Port Arthur, initiating the Russo-Japanese War. This conflict was fought not only for dominance in Manchuria and Korea, but for international recognition. After a grueling war on land and sea, marked by the battles of Mukden and Tsushima, Japan emerged victorious. This was the first time in modern history that an Asian nation defeated a European great power. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, affirmed Japan's dominance over southern Manchuria, granted rights to the South Manchurian Railway, and recognized Japan's paramount influence in Korea. Domestically, this victory ignited a wave of patriotic fervor and accelerated the belief in a manifest destiny to lead Asia. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, instituting a colonial regime that suppressed Korean language, culture, and national identity. Infrastructure was developed. but primarily to serve Japanese interests, with vast landholdings transferred to Japanese settlers and corporations. Education was used as a tool for assimilation, and political dissent was brutally repressed. Beyond Korea, Japan participated in World War I on the side of the Allies, seizing German possessions in the Pacific and in China's Shandong Peninsula. Although Japan hoped for greater recognition at the post-war Versailles Conference, it was denied racial equality provisions and territorial ambitions in China, an affront that deepened its mistrust of the West. The 1920s saw both expansion and frustration. Japan acquired mandates over Pacific Islands and joined the League of Nations, but its ambitions were curtailed by naval treaties and diplomatic pressure. These years were also marked by internal tensions, economic instability, and the emergence of ultranationalist ideologies that would increasingly dominate the country's political discourse. The domestic climate was further unsettled by the devastating Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which destroyed large parts of Tokyo and Yokohama. The disaster left over 100,000 dead and triggered economic strain, food shortages, and social unrest. In the aftermath, right-wing paramilitary groups gained prominence, scapegoating minorities like Koreans and socialists. Assassinations of liberal politicians by nationalist extremists became increasingly common, weakening democratic institutions. By the end of the 1920s, the political atmosphere had turned toxic. The Army and Navy operated with increasing autonomy, and public discourse was saturated with militaristic and imperial rhetoric. Japan had transformed from an isolated island nation into a formidable imperial power in the span of a few decades. But with power came new complexities: how to maintain control over a growing empire, navigate global politics, and define its own national purpose in an age of colonial empires and rising global tensions. The seeds of conflict, both external and internal, had been planted. The dawn of the 1930s marked a decisive turning point. Japan, grappling with the fallout from the global Great Depression, saw a dramatic shift in its political and social fabric. Economic hardship devastated rural populations, with tenant farmers unable to pay rents and forced into debt or displacement. Urban areas faced unemployment and rising costs of living, while small businesses were crushed under the weight of failing consumer demand. These conditions created fertile ground for extremism. The Japanese military, increasingly independent from civilian oversight, positioned itself as the savior of the nation. Military academies gained influence, instilling officers with a deep sense of loyalty to the emperor and the belief that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia. Political violence surged. The May 15, 1932 incident, in which Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated by naval officers, signaled a turning point. Civilian control was fatally weakened. More coups and insurrections followed, including the February 26th incident of 1936, where radical army factions seized parts of Tokyo in an attempt to purge the government of perceived corruption and weakness. Though the coup failed, the military's political dominance was solidified. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 was not merely a military conquest, but a model for imperial expansion. Japan invested heavily in infrastructure and industry, establishing schools, police forces, and administrative bodies, all under Japanese control. Resources such as coal, iron, and soybeans were extracted and funneled to support Japan's growing industrial base. Manchuria became a showcase for the future of the Japanese Empire, a place where economic exploitation, settler colonialism, and military rule operated in unison. At home, the government transformed everyday life into a theater of nationalism. Patriotic organizations like the Imperial Youth Corps indoctrinated children. Women were urged to become mothers of the empire, praised for their domestic sacrifice. Festivals and public rituals glorified the emperor and the martial spirit. Even diet and clothing were nationalized. Rice was deemed the patriotic staple, and Western suits were increasingly eschewed in favor of military-style uniforms. The media, now tightly controlled, portrayed China and the West as existential threats. Newspapers published daily stories of heroism from the front lines, while movies and novels dramatized samurai legends and romanticized death in service to the emperor. The concept of Japaneseness was weaponized. Only those who conformed to the state's ideals were considered loyal subjects. Foreign influences were censored, intellectuals persecuted, and Christians and communists monitored. By 1937, Japan's ideological apparatus had fused with its military machine. Total war was no longer an abstract concept. It was a reality being rehearsed in Manchuria and normalized in daily life. Expansion was justified not as conquest, but as liberation, delivering Asia from Western imperialism. In reality, it laid the groundwork for a brutal empire built on violence, repression, and exploitation. The empire was not simply marching to war. It was mobilizing an entire society to believe that war was righteous, inevitable, and glorious. The year 1937 marked a dark turning point in Japan's imperial journey. What began as a localized confrontation at the Marco Polo Bridge spiraled into a full-scale war of aggression against China. The Marco Polo Bridge incident, a seemingly minor exchange of fire, was seized upon by Japanese military leaders as a justification for broad invasion plans that had already been set in motion. The campaign quickly expanded into northern and eastern China, engulfing major cities and civilian populations in unprecedented violence. Shanghai, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in Asia, became the site of a brutal three-month battle. Japanese naval bombardments, aerial attacks, and infantry assaults turned the city into a smoking ruin. Despite fierce Chinese resistance, Japan's better-equipped forces eventually secured control, but at the cost of over 300,000 casualties on both sides. Following this, the Japanese military pushed inland toward Nanjing, the political heart of nationalist China. The capture of Nanjing in December 1937 ushered in a period of unimaginable horror. Over the course of 6 weeks, the Japanese army committed atrocities that shocked the world. Conservative estimates suggest that 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were massacred. Women, children, and the elderly were not spared. Tens of thousands of women were raped, many of them killed afterward to erase evidence. Eyewitness accounts describe bayonet practice on live victims, mass executions, and entire neighborhoods torched. Foreign missionaries and diplomats who remained in the city documented the carnage with photographs and letters, providing a chilling archive of the atrocities. Japan's military leaders framed the campaign as a necessary mission to stabilize East Asia, presenting themselves as liberators. State-controlled media glorified the army's efforts, censored dissent, and discredited foreign criticism as anti-Japanese propaganda. Within Japan, the invasion bolstered nationalist fervor and consolidated public support for the war. Art, cinema, and education were co-opted into the war effort. School children were taught to idolize the emperor and view death in battle as the highest honor. Newspapers printed fabricated stories of enemy atrocities to maintain morale and legitimize further expansion. Yet, Japan misjudged the resolve of the Chinese people. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces regrouped in the southwestern city of Chongqing, establishing a new wartime capital. Simultaneously, Mao Zedong's communist forces expanded their influence through guerrilla warfare in the countryside. The conflict evolved into a war of attrition. Japan controlled major cities and railways, but vast rural areas remained hostile. Supply lines were under constant attack, and Japanese troops were spread dangerously thin across thousands of kilometers. To sustain this protracted conflict, Japan enacted the National Mobilization Law in 1938, granting the state sweeping powers over the economy, media, and labor force. Every facet of daily life was militarized. School children recited patriotic pledges, factory workers met strict quotas, and food rationing became severe. Women were conscripted into labor and encouraged to bear children for the empire. Spies and informants were embedded in every neighborhood. As the war dragged on, the toll on Japanese soldiers also mounted. Letters from the front reveal growing psychological trauma, disillusionment, and fear. Desertions and suicides rose. At home, wartime propaganda masked the rising costs of the conflict, portraying every death as a noble sacrifice for the emperor. Veterans who returned were often traumatized and silenced by social stigma and government censorship. In 1940, Japan formalized its global ambitions by joining the Axis powers in a tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This alliance emboldened Japan to expand its territorial ambitions beyond China. The occupation of French Indochina in 1940 allowed Japan to block supply routes to Chinese forces and positioned its military closer to British and Dutch colonial holdings in Southeast Asia. Alarmed by Japan's escalating aggression, the United States imposed economic sanctions, culminating in the freezing of Japanese assets and the crucial oil embargo of July 1941. This move threatened to paralyze Japan's economy and military operations, as Japan imported over 90% of its oil. Faced with the prospect of strategic collapse or total war, Japan's leaders chose the latter. Secret plans were drawn up for a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, Japanese strategists developed an ambitious campaign to capture the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and other resource-rich colonies. Their objective was to create a fortified perimeter that would be impervious to Allied counterattacks, forcing the West to negotiate peace on Japan's terms. By late 1941, Japan stood poised to ignite a global war unlike anything Asia had ever seen. At 7:48 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, a meticulously coordinated Japanese attack launched from 6 aircraft carriers shattered the stillness of Pearl Harbor. Led by Admiral Chuchi Nagumo under the overall strategic vision of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, over 350 warplanes targeted U.S. battleships, cruisers, airfields, and critical infrastructure. The first wave struck with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The second wave aimed to destroy hangars, repair facilities, and any surviving aircraft. By the end of the attack, 4 battleships were sunk, 4 more severely damaged, and the Pacific Fleet's backbone lay crippled. The USS Arizona exploded violently, killing 1,177 sailors instantly. Though the intended targets, U.S. aircraft carriers, were absent, the psychological impact was profound. The attack unified a previously divided American public. President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his now famous speech the following day, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and Congress declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy followed by declaring war on the United States, solidifying a global conflagration. Japan's simultaneous offensive strategy, executed across vast swaths of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, reflected years of wargaming and operational planning. In Malaya, the Japanese 25th Army conducted a rapid overland advance through dense jungle, outflanking British defenses considered impassable. By February 1942, Singapore, known as the Gibraltar of the East, fell with over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops surrendering in one of the most lopsided defeats in British military history. The capture of the Dutch East Indies followed, yielding vital oil fields that Japan desperately needed to sustain its navy and air force. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces fought valiantly, but U.S. command was forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and then to the island fortress of Corregidor. The fall of these strongholds was punctuated by the Bataan Death March, an atrocity involving 75,000 prisoners of war subjected to beatings, starvation, summary executions, and prolonged deprivation during their forced march to prison camps. In each theater, Japanese military forces employed a combination of air superiority, surprise landings, psychological warfare, and ruthless discipline. In Hong Kong, the Christmas Day surrender of British forces gave rise to widespread civilian massacres and the internment of Western civilians. In Burma, Japanese troops pushed back British and Chinese units, aiming to cut off China from Allied support. At home, Japan's government transformed into a total war regime. Under the Taisei Yakusenkai, Imperial Rule Assistance Association, all political parties were dissolved. Industry was nationalized, and labor was directed toward war production. The state integrated religion, education, and mass media to glorify the emperor and promote martyrdom. Every citizen, from school children to elderly women, was mobilized in service of the Kokutai, the national polity centered around imperial divinity and sacrifice. Yet beneath this wave of euphoria and apparent invincibility, logistical cracks deepened. The sheer geographic expanse of Japan's empire strained shipping capacity. The Imperial Japanese Navy lacked sufficient anti-submarine warfare capacity, and U.S. submarines began sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate. Japanese attempts to pacify occupied territories failed as local populations turned to resistance. In the Dutch East Indies, guerrillas sabotaged infrastructure. In the Philippines, the Hagbalahap movement launched a broad insurgency. Meanwhile, in darkened rooms at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, were deciphering Jan 25, Japan's naval code. Their breakthroughs would soon change the course of the war. Japan's expansion had reached its zenith, but the counterstroke was forming on the horizon. By mid-1942, Japan's rapid expansion had begun to encounter formidable resistance from a rapidly mobilizing Allied force. The early success of Japan's conquest was grounded in surprise, coordination, and overwhelming momentum. But the empire's logistical foundations were shallow, and its overextension would soon prove fatal. The first major strategic turning point occurred at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Although the battle was technically a draw, with both sides suffering carrier losses, it marked a crucial moment. Japan's attempt to capture Port Moresby was thwarted. It was the first naval battle in which opposing ships never saw each other, conducted entirely by carrier-based aircraft. Only a month later, the decisive clash at Midway changed the course of the war. U.S. cryptographers, most notably at Station HYPO under Commander Joseph Rockefort, had broken the Japanese naval code Gen 25. Armed with foreknowledge of Japan's target, Admiral Chester Nimitz laid a trap. When Admiral Nagumo's strike force attacked Midway Atoll, U.S. carriers USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet launched a counterstrike that caught Japanese carriers rearming and refueling planes. For Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk. Meanwhile, the battle for Guadalcanal raged from August 1942 to February 1943. This campaign centered on Henderson Field, a vital airstrip. The Japanese launched relentless naval bombardments and air raids. Allied troops held despite malaria, jungle rot, and supply shortages. The waters around the island, called Iron Bottom Sound, became a graveyard of warships. The Tokyo Express suffered heavy losses. Eventually, Japan withdrew. Guadalcanal was a strategic and symbolic victory for the Allies. It marked the end of Japan's capacity to take the offensive and forced the Imperial High Command into a defensive posture. It also validated the evolving strategy of island hopping, leapfrogging fortified Japanese positions to seize strategic locations for airfields and supply depots. This allowed the Allies to push toward Japan without confronting its strongest garrisons head-on. American industry now surged into dominance. Liberty ships, Essex-class carriers, and squadrons of Hellcats and Avengers rolled off production lines at unprecedented speed. In contrast, Japan struggled to replace lost ships and pilots. Training programs were shortened, fuel was rationed, and raw materials dwindled. Meanwhile, the Allies formed new coalitions, bringing in Australian, New Zealander, Filipino, Chinese, and British forces into coordinated theaters of war. As the Americans advanced, so too did their understanding of Japanese resolve. Captured documents and intercepted communications revealed the extent to which Japanese military doctrine viewed death as preferable to defeat. This understanding would shape the Allied approach in future campaigns, where psychological warfare, propaganda, and even strategic deception would play increasingly important roles. The Pacific, once a vast and uncertain frontier for the Allies, was now a map of opportunity. The Japanese Empire was bleeding, and the Allies were preparing the next blows. Following the turning points at Midway and Guadalcanal, Allied momentum became an unstoppable wave. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur made good on his dramatic promise to return to the Philippines. The amphibious landings on Leyte were the culmination of years of careful logistical buildup and operational planning. The Filipino population, scarred by Japanese occupation, rose in resistance alongside Allied forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf remains the largest naval battle in history. Japan launched Operation Shogo, deploying the remnants of their surface fleet in a desperate counteroffensive. Despite heavy losses and initial confusion, American forces prevailed. It was during this battle that Japan launched its first mass wave of kamikaze attacks, acts of desperation that defined its dying empire. After Leyte, the Allies pushed into Luzon, leading to the brutal Battle of Manila. Urban warfare devastated the city. Japanese troops committed atrocities, massacres, rapes, and executions. Over 100,000 civilians were killed. Manila became the second most devastated Allied capital of the war after Warsaw. Meanwhile, American B-29 bombers began a firebombing campaign over Japan. The most devastating, Operation Meeting House, destroyed Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945. Over 100,000 people died in one night. The devastation surpassed even the atomic bombings that would follow. In April 1945, Allied forces launched the assault on Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific. Kamikaze planes struck the U.S. fleet relentlessly, causing catastrophic damage. On land, Japanese forces and Okinawan conscripts turned hills and caves into fortified positions. The battle raged for nearly 3 months. Civilians were caught in a tragic crossfire. Influenced by wartime propaganda and fear, many resorted to desperate actions. Entire families were lost in the chaos, and countless non-combatants perished. The toll was staggering. Over 240,000 people died, including more than 150,000 civilians. Inside Japan, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Supply chains collapsed, railways stopped running, and food shortages became dire. Children participated in daily air raid drills. The government's Kitsugo plan called for every citizen to resist an expected Allied invasion. Makeshift weapons and last resort training reflected the nation's desperation. Behind the scenes, Japanese leadership debated paths to peace. Some favored a conditional surrender through Soviet intermediaries, while others clung to the ideal of honorable resistance. Emperor Hirohito, viewed as a divine figure, remained distant as the nation suffered. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Allied leaders prepared a final measure. In laboratories and strategy rooms, they were readying a new weapon, one that would forever alter the course of history. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation on the brink. Cities were in ruins, food was scarce, and the population was shattered. Yet its military leaders hoped to resist long enough to force better surrender terms. Meanwhile, American planners prepared Operation Downfall, expecting catastrophic losses on both sides. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima. The explosion flattened 5 square miles, killing tens of thousands instantly. Survivors suffered burns, radiation sickness, and unimaginable trauma. Shadows were seared into stone, ghostly remnants of lives lost in seconds. 3 days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. Though its geography reduced the blast, over 70,000 died by year's end. Nagasaki's civilian population, including a large Christian community, highlighted the indiscriminate nature of atomic warfare. Survivors, known as hibakusha, faced lasting health issues and social stigma, later becoming powerful voices for peace. On August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Red Army stormed into Manchuria, overwhelming the once feared Guandong Army. Soviet forces rapidly advanced, taking Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and reaching northern Korea. Japan now faced invasion from both east and west. In Tokyo, the leadership plunged in a crisis. Some officials still clung to hopes of resistance. Others, fearing total destruction, sought surrender if the emperor could remain. For the first time in history, Emperor Hirohito convened an imperial conference. Breaking tradition, he spoke directly and chose surrender. On August 15, 1945, in a historic radio address, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Speaking in solemn, archaic Japanese, he cited a desire to avoid further suffering and referenced the new and most cruel bomb. For many Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. The moment marked the symbolic end of the empire. In the chaotic days after the surrender announcement, not all accepted defeat. A faction of military officers attempted a last-minute coup, aiming to destroy the emperor's recorded message. The plot failed. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers. General Douglas MacArthur presided, declaring an end to the most destructive conflict in human history. For Japan, the surrender was both a collapse and a beginning. Many citizens felt shame and sorrow, but also relief. The atomic bombings ignited global debate. Were they necessary to end the war, or acts of intimidation toward the Soviet Union? Survivors, the hibakusha, eventually became global voices for peace. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became eternal symbols of destruction and resilience. The Divine Empire was no more. From its ashes, post-war Japan would rise as a new nation. With the empire collapsed, Japan entered a period of historic transformation. On August 30th, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo to lead the Allied occupation. Under SCAP, sweeping reforms began. The military was disbanded, weapons production banned, and soldiers returned home, many struggling to reintegrate. A new constitution was drafted in just 1 week. Enacted in 1947, it included universal suffrage and civil rights. Most famously, Article 9 renounced war entirely. Education was restructured to focus on democracy and peace. State Shinto lost official support. In a 1946 broadcast, Emperor Hirohito renounced his divinity, a seismic moment for a nation built on imperial worship. Women gained full political rights. In 1946, they voted and ran for office for the first time. Land reform broke up old estates, empowering tenant farmers. Labor unions emerged. Censorship was lifted, then reshaped subtly by Cold War pressures. Japan was not simply occupied, it was remade. Justice came through the Tokyo trials, where 28 top leaders were charged with crimes against peace. 7 were executed, including Hideki Tojo, while others received life sentences. But the trials were selective. Emperor Hirohito was spared, and many others, scientists, bureaucrats, business leaders, went unpunished and later returned to public life. Across Asia, survivors sought truth. In Korea, victims of forced labor and sexual slavery were rarely acknowledged. In China, memories of Nanjing and Unit 731 remained central to national trauma. In Southeast Asia, occupation sparked both horror and anti-colonial resistance. Inside Japan, memory fractured. Older generations recalled bombings and hunger. Younger ones learned peace and progress. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became global centers of remembrance. Survivors, the Hibakusha, faced stigma but emerged as voices for peace and testimony. During the Cold War, Japan shifted from defeated empire to key U.S. ally. The Korean War jump-started its economy, transforming wartime factories into industrial powerhouses. By the 1960s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy. But history cast long shadows. Visits to Yasukuni Shrine by political leaders, where war criminals are honored, sparked outrage in China and Korea. School textbooks softened references to atrocities. Nationalist politicians tried to restore pride in the imperial past, while activists fought to preserve truth and memory. Japan's journey from empire to democracy is one of transformation and tension. Survivors, memorials, and education shaped remembrance, but debates continue. The legacy of empire lives on in politics, diplomacy, and the voices of those who refuse to forget. Decades after World War II, Japan's imperial legacy continues to spark debate. Article 9 of Japan's pacifist constitution, renouncing war, remains a symbol of peace and a political flashpoint. Efforts to revise it have ignited mass protests, with critics warning that remilitarization could undo decades of post-war progress. Meanwhile, Japan's self-defense forces have expanded their global role, sparking unease. Nationalist groups glorify wartime leaders, while revisionists attempt to reshape history. In China, Japan's wartime actions remain central to national identity. Museums and public events keep the memory of atrocities like the rape of Nanjing alive. In Korea, unresolved issues like forced labor and comfort women still impact diplomacy. Survivors seek recognition, while protests and court rulings continue to fuel tensions. In Southeast Asia, memories of occupation are complex, blending pain, resistance, and post-colonial reflection. Inside Japan, education remains a battleground. Textbooks vary in how they address wartime atrocities, reflecting broader cultural divides over history and identity. Despite lingering tensions, movements for reconciliation are growing. Civil society groups, often led by women and youth, build bridges through cross-border dialogue, shared history projects, and survivor advocacy. Art, film, manga, and literature explore the empire's legacy with empathy, helping new generations engage with the past. Japan plays a global role in peace diplomacy and humanitarian aid, shaped by the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Survivors, the Hibakusha, speak at the UN and in classrooms worldwide. Once silenced, their voices now lead the global call for nuclear disarmament. Japan's rise from defeat to peace and prosperity is extraordinary. Yet its imperial legacy still echoes in textbooks, treaties, and public debate. As survivors pass on, the task of remembrance belongs to the next generation. What they choose to remember or forget will shape the future of peace in Asia and beyond. The story of Japanese imperialism is not just about war and empire, but about how nations and peoples choose to remember, forget, and heal. The rise and fall of the Japanese Empire offers a lens into the deepest contradictions of modern history: progress and violence, pride and guilt, collapse and rebirth. In its wake lies a fragmented mosaic of narratives: official state memory, survivor testimony, nationalist denial, and grassroots truth-telling. In classrooms across Japan, history teachers still grapple with how to present the empire. Some fear reprisals or controversy. Others push boundaries to teach a more critical, nuanced past. Students are encouraged to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but fewer are taught in depth about Nanjing, Unit 731, or the comfort women system. In Korea, children grow up learning songs of resistance and trauma. In China, annual rituals of remembrance coincide with political messaging. In the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, generational distance has blurred recollections, but oral traditions, local museums, and war relics keep history alive. The international community continues to negotiate the balance between justice and diplomacy. Memorials, apologies, and reparations can offer solace, but they also provoke backlash, especially when perceived as performative or insincere. Each new administration, whether in Tokyo, Seoul, or Beijing, faces the question: how do we honor history without being trapped by it? Reconciliation remains fragile, requiring sustained empathy, transparency, and courage. Artists, filmmakers, and historians play a vital role in this ongoing negotiation. Films like Grave of the Fireflies, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, and Caterpillar explore trauma from varied angles. Exhibitions of Hiroshima artifacts, testimony projects for comfort women, and community-led oral histories help bridge the gap between data and emotion. Digital archives, immersive virtual storytelling, and cross-national student exchanges serve as modern tools of remembrance and reconciliation, challenging revisionism with collaboration and dialogue. Ultimately, the legacy of empire asks something from each of us, not only to learn, but to act, to challenge the resurgence of ultranationalism, Holocaust denial, and historical relativism, to amplify the voices of the Hibakusha, the survivors of sexual slavery, forced laborers, orphan children, and others too often forgotten, to reflect deeply on what it means to build peace, not as the absence of war, but as a proactive, collective act of justice and memory. As new generations inherit the world shaped by these histories, the lessons of Japanese imperialism remain urgent. The empire has fallen, but its shadows endure, cast by the light of remembrance. And it is in that light that we must continue to search, to question, to mourn, and to remember. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If this documentary moved you, sparked curiosity, or raised new questions, we invite you to help keep the conversation alive. Share this video with others. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that continue to shape our world. Don't forget to like, follow, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter in our shared human journey. History is not behind us, it lives within us.